Hi, everybody. I'm Jane Noel. I'm from Dreamforge Magazine, and we're here today to talk about the perfect pitch and the evolving short story market. And the first thing we're going to do is introduce our panel. So why don't we start with Neil?
Hi, I'm Neil Clarke. I'm the publisher and editor of Clark's World magazine, and I also edit a number of anthologies, including the Best Science Fiction of the Year series.
And Catherine?
I'm Catherine Lundoff. I'm a publisher and editor and writer from Minneapolis. I run Queen of Swords Press, and I have edited or co-edited a couple of anthologies, both for Queen of Swords and other publishers, and I've written for a number of anthologies.
Wonderful. And I know that guy Scott up in the corner, but everybody else doesn't know him. So
yeah, I'm Scot Noel. I'm the publisher and editor for Dreamforge magazine, which is actually something that Jane and I do together. And we just started a couple of years ago, like in late 2017. It was just something we wanted to do to start doing a nice positive science fiction magazine. So that's us.
So we can start it off with like what do we see happening in today's short story market, and how do you see it being different from it was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago? Go ahead,
Okay.
Neil. Looks like you're ready.
Yeah, well, I mean, 20 or 30 years ago, you really didn't have much in the way of the online publication. So that's completely new. Most of the changes have taken place within the last 15 years. So you're seeing a lot of new magazines coming up through the works, but you're also seeing a number of non-traditional outlets for short fiction. So, like Slate is in the short fiction game now, and Wired has done a number of short stories, and a lot of markets, like a lot of magazines like those have started doing occasional short fiction, and then you have all the self-published stuff as well. You've had sort of a boom also thanks to ebooks changing everything. So that's sort of the basis of all the change.
Well, and I think visually too, like you have Dust TV and Love, Death, and Robots and Black Mirror. That you're seeing some outlets for stories even in the the TV market and the small production market.
Yeah, things that aren't really traditionally seen as short stories per se, but they harken back to almost Twilight Zone type ideas. But Love, Death, Robots in particular was very short stories, but visually presented. Who was the other one that did the short stories that they did a very visual presentation of a printed short story? It wasn't Slate, but it was another online magazine doing animated versions of short stories.
Yes, I'm blanking on the name.
It started with a V, but I can't get it. I love those stories. They were really beautifully done. Catherine, what do you see as being things that are different in the market now than they used to?
Well, there's things like media tie-ins that certainly didn't exist, 25, 30 years ago, certainly not the way they do now. I would also say that there's, I've been writing and getting published for over 20 years now, and there's been a definite shift in the interest in including diverse voices for a variety of meetings for that. And that's everything from, literature and translation to, authors of color, to LGBTQ authors, to more women getting published. I can remember when I got into the field that there were several prominent magazines that had a rotating cast of 2 or 3 women in the table of contents, and that was it. And if you got your nebula, then you could have your short stories published in there, but otherwise you aren't getting published there. And it was an ongoing problem. And, it still is for some things, but there's definitely been a lot more focus on it. And I think that one of the things that the internet brings, in addition to increased opportunities, is also that there's a lot more awareness of the voices that are getting passed over and how they need to be brought into the conversation and brought into the publications and brought into the tables of contents, so that work is getting seen.
That's one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about, was the idea, because I know Neil does a lot with the translations from other countries, and that's a more voices the same way as some of the diverse groups and minorities, and like you said, even women. And one of the things that I think is interesting there is how the voices can be heard through social media. There's a lot more awareness of those groups, and then maybe a little more willingness to serve them because of things like when Uncanny did the Kickstarter for like Queers Destroy Science Fiction or Disabled People Destroy Science. There's like an awareness that there's an audience for those things.
Yeah, Lightspeed did the original Queer Women Destroy Science Fiction and Queers Destroy Science Fiction. Nightmare did the Queers Destroy Horror, and then Uncanny did Disabled Authors Destroy Science Fiction and that series. So yeah.
And I think that it's just that idea that there's an awareness, that there's an audience that will read those and will support those. How do you see that? How do you see as an industry we can improve that?
We do it more than special issues. That's how we improve that. We make it part of our DNA and who we are and what we do.
Yeah. Scot, did you have something to add there?
The one thing I can bring to this panel, since we're brand new in this, is just sort of the perspective of the new guy who walks in the room and stuff happens and it's like, oh, I didn't think this stuff was going to happen. And so we were surprised when we started publishing, both by the volume of submissions that we got and where they came from. So when you talk about diversity, we definitely saw that. And there are lots of people who are very willing to self-identify, I'm writing queer fiction or I'm writing disabled fiction, that sort of thing, and to say I'm from this group and I'm trying to represent them. And also stories from around the world, because we're brand new and didn't really think that we'd get a lot of attention as far as authors, but we were ready for maybe hundreds of submissions, but when we opened for reading period, we get like 1,000 submissions from around the world that we're getting them from English speaking countries, though I'm not getting a lot of translations, but we get stuff from New Zealand and Germany and Finland and Australia and India and just so many people out there. I think that's one of the things that surprises me, is how many people and who are trying to write and are from all of these different places, and they're so interested in speculative fiction and trying to get their voices out there. So I'm kind of amazed at the level of writers that are out there, how many there are and how much they're trying to do.
Catherine, have you had any experience with the other countries? And I know you do a lot with the queer science fiction, and you do a lot of dark fantasy, things like that, but what other voices have you published or been working to publish?
We just put out a collection of linked short stories by A.J. Fitzwater, who's a genderqueer author from New Zealand. And so that's their first collection, and that came out in April. And a year ago, we put out a collection, an anthology rather, of fantastical pirate stories. And one of the things that I wanted to add to this was that I think that things like special issues serve well for being icebreakers, but then after that, being aware of what's out there and looking at what you have and going, okay, what am I missing from an editorial and publishing standpoint is really important. And so what I did with the Pirate Anthology, because I edited that one, was I put out a call and I opened it to all genders, all orientations of characters. I picked pirates because they're a universal phenomenon. Pretty much any place that has a coastline at some point in history has had pirates. So I specifically asked for international submissions. I asked for multiple perspectives. I asked for multiple identities, and I got them. I ended up getting submissions from 14 different countries. and and some just amazing stuff. When I drilled down, the final TOC was, I think, authors from 10 different countries, and I picked based on that. I mean, I picked stories I liked, but I also picked things where I looked at it and went, okay, I don't have representation here. What can we do about that? Is there somebody I can invite? Is there a group that I can do outreach to get more things to come in? And so I built that table of contents very consciously to get something that was international and reflective of a wide range of authors and perspectives. So.
I really like that you basically asked for it. That's how you get it. You ask for it. Well, Neil, how did you get into doing the translation work, and what drew you to that?
Well, I think it was just paying attention to the slush pile initially and seeing that we weren't getting a lot of submission. Like it was very dominated by American voices in the slush pile, and I knew there was a lot of work that was in languages I couldn't read, so I would regularly talk about this at panels and stuff like that about finding different ways. And the first translated story we published was courtesy of Ken Liu, who I think it was the first one that he was doing. He sent it to us and we loved it, and we asked him for more, and that caught the attention of a company in China after a few years, and they offered to help fund the translation process. So that translations are expensive. They quite you should be paying the translator at least as much as the author. So it doubles or more than doubles the cost of things. So that's where one of the major obstacles is for publishers is budget. So for them to come in and offer to do that was a big deal. And we've been working with them for over 5 years now. And then we've gotten grant funding to do South Korea series, and we spread those out over the course of a year because, like I said, I think you need to incorporate it in. So we try to make sure that we have a translation in each issue, but we are also very aware of the fact that there's a lot of different places where access to a translator isn't exactly convenient for those authors. So next year we're planning on a project to open to submissions in Spanish, which is a language I don't read, and then we'll commission the translations. So that's going to be a fun thing to try and tackle.
Yeah, you're truly going to become international with that, because I'm sure you read internationally. It's the idea that to have the voices heard from.
Well, that's the thing. When you're publishing an online magazine, you are an international publication. You really should reflect your readership as best you can.
Yeah, I think that's a tremendous effort. You've done great things with that. I heard that you were doing something with the Korean as well as Chinese. So I think that's great. And then to hear you're going to Spanish as well, that's fantastic. Yeah.
And we've had a few other languages, one-offs here and there. We had a Japanese story last month, and so it's nice when they come in, but we need to find ways of bringing more in. The biggest problem with drawing in international fiction is a lot of the authors don't think they're welcome. It's the number one question I get from foreign authors is, am I allowed to submit a story? So I'm constantly screaming, yes, please do.
That's kind of like Catherine said there, you ask, and to make sure that is welcome. No, we haven't seen things coming into Dreamforce that aren't English language, but we are getting them from different countries. Scott, what are some of the countries we've had from? Because I know one was South America.
Yeah, it was Gustavo Bandini, Sip of Palm Bay. I forget where he's from. Is it might be Brazil, but we had published a young poet from India who did an amazing piece of work for us, because he generally tends to write very dark things. And one of the interesting things about Dreamforce, because we want to be this hopeful magazine, right, is that I'm amazed by the number of authors who approach and say, I really do dark things. I see things apocalyptically, but here, let me show you this. And it turns out to be this wonderful piece of light. And he actually wrote a poem that, and remember, English isn't his first native language, but he sent us a poem that basically you read it one way and it talks about the destruction of the world, how we're moving through an age of apocalypse down to destroy the environment and destroy ourselves. And then if you start at the bottom of the poem and you read those same lines in reverse order to the top of the poem, it reverses the entire meaning. And it basically says we can take on any challenge, we can overcome the destruction of the earth, the future ahead is bright. And it just depends on which top or bottom of the poem you start with. And so we've had some very interesting, things like that where people who tend to write dark, will write light for us and come to us from all sorts of, these different countries with their own take on that. So, I think there's a bit of an appetite around the world to basically have somebody say, the world's not going to end tomorrow, that we can take on challenges and we can overcome the things that are negative right now.
How do you see the internet and online social media, things like that, affecting the market moving forward? Beyond the idea of doing more of what we're doing now and things like that, do you see other changes coming that might affect what people are writing now or what they should be writing now or how to reach out?
I'll start just because I wanted to just talk about marketing anyway, and other people can chime in on this. But I find that marketing is very, very difficult. There is just so much. We're in an age of media, both social media and 10 million channels on TV and all sorts of movies and graphic novels and comics and that there's just so much content that's available that it's really hard to catch people's attention and say, here's this thing over here, look at me, you might like this. And it's not just it's actually from a marketing point of view, it's a matter of money. Like what we're seeing is that it costs more to capture that new reader than I can charge for the magazine. So, that's an issue. That it's just hard to basically put yourself out there and get the audience you need to sustain the publication. So marketing, I think, is a real challenge, especially for new magazines in the field.
And Catherine, how about for you with marketing and anthology?
Well, I think that there are some perfectly sound economic reasons that a lot of publishers have moved to crowdsourcing the funding for anthologies. They generally do not pay for themselves ultimately. They can. It's not impossible, but it's difficult to get ramp up, especially if you're in a smaller press, you're going into it with a smaller budget for marketing to begin with. So I think that going forward, there will probably be more crowdsourcing, Kickstartering, Indiegogos, and so forth to try and to circumvent that. The main thing, though, is that for something with a crowdsourcing campaign, often you have a nice upfront push, but keeping the momentum going, getting the reviews, getting it out there can be a little more challenging after that point. Whereas if you're starting out, with the initial push that everything goes out the door and goes to all the various markets and goes to all of the various review sites and so forth, you're starting in a different place. So I think that, I anticipate, for example, that we're going to be attempting to crowdsource our next anthology, for example, because I think that the benefits are going to outweigh the risks on how to keep it going long-term from there.
And Neil, you've not done anything with the kind of crowdsourcing sort of thing, but your model is based on donation.
I've actually crowdfunded two, an anthology and a collection. And part of our business model for Clarke's World is Patreon. So that's a different breed, which really is more aimed at recurring projects like a magazine. So the difference on a book and magazine marketing are quite significant since the book is a one shot, and you're really trying to keep people coming back you want subscriptions with the magazine. And I think that's one of the biggest problems right now for short fiction, at least in magazines. As you were saying, it costs more to get somebody than it does than you can sell for. Right now, short fiction is very undervalued. If you look at it comparatively across other things that are being novels or novellas or whatever, what they're charging for those things, it's out of whack. I mean, we're charging average subscription price for a magazine right now in digital form is $1.99 or $2.99. It really should be $2.99 or $3.99, and that just tiny change would be a major financial boost to so many of the publications. And it's really important to note that so few of the editors publishing right now are actually making money. Like, they might break even. That means the authors are getting money, but the editors aren't getting paid, or the staff isn't getting paid. And that's a huge problem for the long-term health prospects of short fiction.
It is, so much of it's done volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that people really realize how much goes into it. But as an entirely volunteer organization, you know, everything that you make goes to keeping it running. And there is some level of burnout to that too, that people have to deal with. When you talk about that, Scott had pointed me to an article a little bit ago here. It was on medium.com, and the author there was Holly Lynn Walrath. And she was saying, she was writing about a friend of hers who is a successful short story writer who feels he has to write a novel. So he's struggling to write a novel because the economics of short story, he feels he won't be a real writer unless he can write a novel and get a novel published. And the economics of it are just like back in the day, like when you're talking in the 30s and 40s and 50s even, when you look at the equivalent, it would be roughly, in today's money, $1,000 for a short story, compared to now it's much, much lower than that, like $300, $400, $500 for a short story. You can't make a living on it. So what do you see as, why do people even bother to write short stories? Why is short fiction even a market when there's no economics behind it at all?
To be fair, they were supplementing their incomes with nonfiction writing. A number of them were writing in other genres under pseudonyms so that they could make enough so there's never really been a great time for short fiction in terms of
there's not a great time for writers pretty much anywhere.
Yeah. So I mean comparatively to the past, yeah, it stinks. And you know, it took a long time to get pay rates to start moving upwards. And every time SFWA increases its qualifying rate, which is not professional rate, it's qualifying, because there's nothing professional about 8 cents a word. But you know, every time that happens, you get a bunch of people complaining, oh, we're going to have fewer qualifying markets because not everyone can pay that. And instead of going, we really need to be setting a pattern of paying more. And some of that is got to go back to the readers too, that, you know, when you look at the online markets, I would say most publications, or actually I don't know anybody who gets more than 10% of their readership paying for what they read. That's where the break is. I mean, if it was 20% of them paying, I think author pay rates would be better. So the ecosystem is broken. And that's really what's going to solve things, is when we fix that problem. So it's a perception problem. The perceived value of short fiction being where it is decreases what authors can get and decreases what editors can get. We're all in it together.
You think some of that is just it's online, it should be free kind of concept?
Some of that, yeah. I mean, I fully acknowledge my complicity in running an online magazine for so long, in creating this situation, and it's a matter now of re-educating our readership to understand the consequences of that. But it's a long-term problem that is going to take a lot of time to fix. Hopefully, we're still around doing this when it is fixed.
Catherine, do you have anything to add?
Well, I mean, the economics of publishing books is different from publishing magazines, and much respect to all of you, I wouldn't touch a magazine. But from a fanish standpoint, and relevant to this, I'm one of the people who kicks into Strange Horizons fund drive every year. And one of the things that they've said consistently each year is people will kick in as long as we're raising the pay rates. They will kick in as long as we're paying for translations. But the minute we say, and if we hit this threshold, we can pay staff, things die off pretty quickly from that point, which is really sad. You know, because they're one of multiple magazines that are doing amazing work and really deserve to be supported. And yeah, I think you're right. I think it's something that really needs to be thought about. And I think that some of it does tap into the, you know, information wants to be free thing. You know, and there's a bunch of things that tap into that, though. I think it's not, you know, any one publication. It's not even necessarily, you know, the last 5 years. It's been around for a while. And you've got, you know, a whole tradition of people posting things for free on their blogs, and you've got things that are, you know, you've got book giveaways that are going on continuously because somebody 10 years ago said that that was the way to get sales on Amazon, you know, so you've got all of this stuff. So I think fiction in general is devalued, and people are less inclined to pay for it because the book will be free here, the stories will be free there, it'll get pirated, which is the thing we also haven't talked about. You know, and pirating fiction is usually more of a book thing, but I'm sure that it spills over into magazines in particular. I'm guessing Clarke's World has trouble with it, at a guess, you know, to one degree or another. You know, but you've got a whole mentality that says, well, I don't have to pay for this, so I'm not going to pay for this now. And, you know, I don't know how you break through that on the large scale. I mean, I think it's definitely an ongoing process. And, you know, one hope is that as you bring new writers into the field and new readers into the field, is that people get to discover what it looks like for themselves, which I think is something that you couldn't really do very well about 20 years ago.
Well, what I'm seeing based on the writers that we work with, like sometimes I feel like I'm like need to be a counselor to the writers who submit things, because I think I get the impression from just especially new writers that you know, if you're publishing a magazine, there must be a lot of money in it, and they want their break in the big time kind of idea is kind of where they're coming from. And you know, if I had if half of the people who submitted things actually bought the magazine, we'd be great. We'd be funded, you know. But I think there's a lot, and I want to talk about this a little bit in the magazine and on my online stuff next year, is just there seem to be a lot of misperceptions from writers as to what the field is like and how they break into the field and whether their story is good or not. Even just before you know, this meeting here, I was writing back to one of our writers, but there's this mentality of well, I hit all the marks. You said you wanted this, and I hit all my marks. You know, I gave you everything you wanted. Why didn't you publish the story? And I think there's just a break in expectations as to what they think is actually happening when a story comes in to a magazine. And you know, you're gonna publish maybe 12 or 13 stories in an issue, but you've got like 700 to 1,000 submissions. It's just like, you know, the odds are just completely against the writer. It doesn't have anything to do with how good they did or whether they hit the mark or gave you exactly what you wanted. You're kind of taking puzzle pieces and you're trying to fit them thematically together. You know, I'm science fiction and fantasy, so I got to split that. I want to do things like Catherine was talking about. I want to look at what's the representation. You know, did I just almost buy everything from men, you know, for this issue? I should pay more attention to that. You know, I should look at what that representation is in the LGBT community and disabled, and like, what have I got that's good, that fits thematically, so you're putting together a puzzle, and 90% of the time you're sending a story back simply because this puzzle piece doesn't fit. You know, I really like this. My first line readers really like this, but I can't fit this in the puzzle right now, and I don't, you know, so it's coming back. Good luck with it elsewhere. So I think there's somewhat in educating even the writers that come to us on what the market is like.
Scott, are you buying for just one issue when you open up, or are you willing to take for another issue down the line?
We look a little bit ahead, but one of the things that we set out to do was really we wanted to pay on acceptance, both for stories and for art. So that means, you know, that the budget is limited. You know, we're trying to just use what we have and that sort of thing. So we have bought ahead. So we have done that where we're buying an issue or two ahead, but by and large, you're still focused down into that small number of stories. 1,000 stories, if you bought like half of them, it would last you like 10 years, and you're not doing that.
One of the questions that came in, and it falls right into one of the things that I wanted to lead to, is, so what advice do you have for the new writers that are trying to break into the pro market? I know one of the main things is they need to know their market and know who they're writing for, because if they're writing for Clarke's World, a story that's going to be something that Clarke's World wants might not be something that Drinkforge wants. And knowing who you're sending it to would make a difference. But what advice do you have for those new writers that are trying to get into the pro market?
I think the first thing I tell people is not to self-reject. Like, unless it specifically says in my guidelines, I don't want X, like zombie stories. Pretty clear, I don't want them. Then yeah, don't send that to me. But if it's not on our hard sell list, send it. And I tell them make a pecking order list of the magazine you most aspire to be in, and start from there down. Because a lot of them will say, "Oh, I'm not good enough to be here," and that's self-rejecting is a bane to all of us.
And I would say basically one of the things that as new writers trying to break in that you may not realize, and I know I'm a very eclectic reader, and my first line readers like a lot of different things too, and we often love your stories, even the ones that may not be quite up to professional level. We're talking about them, we're talking about how good the idea was, and we're talking about the strengths of the story as well as its weaknesses. So we love a lot of the stuff that comes in, and just because you get a story returned to you with or without a comment, it's not a slap across the face. It's like, you weren't good enough, you'll never be a professional writer. It's just a matter of numbers, and it's a matter of time. I was just doing this calculation today. If I tried to spend 10 minutes just writing back to each author in a reading period, that's like 2 full weeks work, and I have a real job besides this. So it just, it's not always possible to come back to you with nice advice and that sort of thing. But we often love a lot of your stories, and we're just, again, trying to put together an issue that works for us thematically and stuff. We don't even agree what all the best stories are. There are arguments about, should we publish this story? Scott likes this story. These guys don't like this story. Jane likes this story. And that's one of the things that I have to do as an editor is ultimately make some of that decision and say, I know you guys love this story, but no, it's not going on this issue. And then, much more rarely, but sometimes and I know you guys don't understand this story, but I do, and it's important, and I'm publishing it. That there's that whole complex thing that's going on, not just experts waving a wand and saying you're worthy, you're not worthy.
Catherine?
I think those are excellent points. I think for me that familiarizing yourself with what a market publishes and what an editor likes or doesn't like is very helpful. As a writer, a lot of my short fiction appears in anthologies rather than magazines, and most of it's been commissioned. So like the vast amount of my short fiction has always been something that somebody has actually specifically asked for. So I haven't been dealing with a lot of the open submission periods that magazines do because of that. So from a publishing standpoint and editing standpoint, when I'm looking at when Queen of Swords opens for submissions, when we're doing anthologies, or we're opening up for linked collections of stories and so forth, is that we're looking for things that fit in with some of what we have. It can go in some new directions, but it's really helpful to have something else that's a jumping off point. So if you're writing for an anthology market and that you're dealing with an editor who's definitely got some sweet spots that you can see, or that they're actually talking about, look at what people are blogging about, look at how they're talking about work, look at the authors that they like as well. Who are they plugging? Who do they seem really interested in? Most of us will talk about, our favorite writers, regardless of whether or not they're friends or we're publishing them or, things of that, that ilk, just because we're also fans. And I think that that's also something to remember. The other thing I would say, just as an across the board message for new writers, something to consider is the pool's not as big as you think it is. So the more professional you are, the more courteous you are, the easier you are to deal with, the more likely it is that even if somebody passes on your story this time, they may recommend you for something else. They may be helpful to you in other ways. So it's a really good idea to, obviously rejections hurt, but if you can get past that, it can be really helpful to reach out and try to establish connections if people are open to that. So.
Nice. If you find a story that you find it's a little rough, but you think it could be a gem in the making, how much effort do you put into polishing that versus moving on to the next story that may be more polished?
I'll jump in. There is some of that happens. Lots of times, for whatever reason, you've decided kind of that this story is really good, but it has a couple of problems. So it's not like, well, there's a germ of a good idea here and we're going to polish this into a good story. But for me, it's often, this is a pretty good story. Like the one that's going to be out in issue 7 that we're doing here toward the end of the year, we have an 8,000 word story or so that started out as over a 10,000 word story. And initially, I basically said, I really like this story, but I sent it back. I rejected it. It's just too long. I'm not going to put, we've already done a series of long stories, and I wanted this one to be about shorter stories. And, the author got into a little bit of a discussion with me, not anything in terms of conflict type thing, but just was asking questions. And it's like, well, would you consider if I tried to cut this back a little bit? And then we got into that discussion of, well, what would that mean? What would we be cutting? And what, if as long as we're talking about revising it, what were the things that I felt were rough spots? And so we did end up basically getting a very polished, lovely story out of that, where initially I, sent back a rejection that was, again, not because of necessarily the quality of the story, but because, well, this doesn't fit. This is way too long for what I want to do right now. And, ended up, getting something out of that.
So we don't do a lot of rewrite requests, which, and I'll differentiate rewrite requests and editing as the ones that we haven't contracted, and say, if you can fix this problem, this thread I pulled that unraveled a large chunk of the story, then we will reconsider it. And success rates on those are all over the map. It depends on the author and how big the problem is. But most of the edits we do, I'll contract a story that I think is in shape where the edits aren't going to be too significant. They might be fact checking, things like the science might be a little off, and we can fix that. That's not a big deal. Most of my edits are actually just questions. I never try and change the story other than like spelling errors, things like that. So I will always ask the author, why did the character do this? Or, does this make sense to have this? And sometimes we'll get into discussion about it then, and there might be some suggestions made at that point. But it varies all over the map.
You have anything to add, Catherine?
Well, I mean, rewrites are, for anthologies, it's a different timeline than it is for magazine publications. So you've got some more flexibility on that. I will ask for rewrites if it's something that, fits into something I want to include. So, for example, when I was working with AJ on this collection of linked short stories, my edits were things like, this expression may mean this to you, but it does not mean this here. And why are we talking about sheep dip? Because that is what the slang expression means here. What does it mean for you? So we had a few things around that. We had stuff like, is this a typo, or are you making a point about gender identity that I'm just not understanding? As it happens, it was a typo. But, so it's those kinds of questions that come up. So I think it's very important to keep those lines of communication open, with the authors, especially if you have decided that this is somebody you want to work with, that you have to keep that at a point where you're able to ask those kinds of questions, as well as, okay, you've misspelled these 3 words. This part doesn't really make sense. But, to be able to talk through, slang, to be able to talk through perceptions and so forth, I think is very useful. But yeah, it's a different timeline thing. So I'll ask for a reroute on something I really want, basically.
We have a handful of questions, and we just got our 10-minute warning there. So one of them, because I think a lot of the people in our audience here are authors, how much of a story do you usually read before you can tell if it's a good fit or anthology?
I'll jump in. 3 pages. Not that we're going to reject it at 3 pages, but by the time I get there, I know whether they've started to engage me and whether I'm interested in this and whether it's, like Neil said, it could be what is equivalent to me of a zombie story. It's a superhero story maybe, and it's like, yeah, just, we're not going to go a lot further with this.
Yeah, I mean, it can be anywhere from the first page, or first word. If it starts with brains, then I'm out. But the most heartbreaking rejections for me are the ones that make it all the way to the end. It means they fumbled the ending, those are the most painful ones. The easy rejections. The stories that are extremely rough and wrong, like story subject matter is all wrong, and they're the easy rejections that doesn't bother me as much. But yeah, all lengths. There's no, once you lose me is when I stop. There's always a red line of death.
Is it different, Catherine, when you're reading for an anthology?
Not really. No, because I mean, you can pretty much see the stuff that absolutely is not going to work under any circumstances pretty early on. It's the stuff that's more ambiguous. Will it make it to the end? Will it make it to the middle? Does it lose you in the middle? That kind of stuff that's a little more challenging to judge. So.
Well,
and also, another point I wanted to make is that, you all, I think, work with staff, and I also have an assistant. So, we hash out a lot of stuff between us. So that's, there's always at least one other person looking at things, unless it's something that I started reading and went, no, absolutely not, a couple of paragraphs in. So.
I should toss in, though, there are some things that will make me go back and or skip ahead to make sure. Like if I get the feeling that the author is just info dumping their world, I'm going to skip ahead a few pages because a lot of people don't know where to start their story. And in the cover letter, if I end up I read the cover letter last, and one of the few times will make me go back is when they tell me that English is not their first language. And any language issues that might have tripped me up, I'll go back and keep that in mind and try it again.
That's interesting. You read the cover letter after the fact. That's
I
good.
have to. They're terrible.
Cover letters never tell you what's going on in the story. They seem to think they do.
Oh, God, do not put summaries in your cover letters.
There's some advice, pretty clear advice. Speaking of not wanting zombie stories at Clarke's World or only wanting hopeful stories at Dreamforge, do you ever find writers deliberately going against the guidelines and saying, oh, I'm sure you'll like it when you do this? How often does that happen where it's like you still get the zombie story or you still get the hopeless story or I'm not sure in Catherine's case what particularly she might be looking for, but if you're doing a pirate anthology, there's no pirate.
Anthologies, yeah. I did send back a series of notes that when I did a ghost story anthology a few years back that said, is there something dead in this story? Because I'm not finding it.
Yeah, we got a screenplay this last time because somebody was convinced we really wanted to publish a screenplay.
We have a long list of things we don't want, and some people think it's really cool, including my own children, by the way, to write a story that incorporates all of them and then send it to me. So I added one more to the bottom of that list, which was stories that include all of the above.
Oh, that's good. Okay. There was another good one. Yeah. I've been losing track of today's short story markets. There seems to be a bewildering variety today. What would you say to be the top short story venues to pay attention to other than your own?
Okay, I edited a year's best anthology. All of my recommendations are in there. So you can find the table of contents. You don't even have to buy the book. The table of contents is on my website. It'll list off all the markets I think are publishing some of the best stories I saw over the last 5 years. And those markets are certainly worth pursuing.
And I agree with Neil, so do exactly what he just said. Other than that, I'll give a plug for actually the fact that we recently were trying to a totally new market. I don't know if anybody's heard of the space nation Asgardia, but there are some Asgardians who are putting out a new science fiction magazine called Planets Rising, planetsrising.com. So, that's a brand new one just coming out, so go check that one out.
I know I like Fireside a lot, and it's partly I do enjoy the stories, but I also enjoy the print magazine on that. There's such a nice style to it that, as an artist, that appeals to me greatly. But I find many of the stories at Fireside really stick. How about you, Catherine? You read a lot of short story markets, or you're involved in the anthology side of it. You might not be on.
I read a fair number of short story markets, both anthologies and magazines. So yeah, I think Fireside does some great work. I think Strange Horizons does some great work. Certainly Uncanny and Clarke's World have, done amazing things, and all of those are definitely worth checking out. I think if what you're looking for is a chance to break into something, however, I would look at things like SFF has a market listing, Raylan.com has a market listing. Afra Stefan Wiebe, who's a fantasy writer from the Twin Cities, has a really good market listing. So there's a lot of market listing things out there. I'd also look at Facebook groups. If you're looking at, horror writers or one of the market things, people will actually also talk about their experiences with a given market, which can be very helpful too when you're assessing whether or not it's worth your time to write for the specific publication.
Another one I think we should mention too is Beneath Ceaseless Skies, because that one, another standard in the industry, and Scott does a tremendous job with that one. I think, let me see if there's another question here. Got some new ones there. Do you know if any editors run manuscripts through AutoCrit or something like that to evaluate? I'm looking at Neil's face and saying no.
No.
I wouldn't. No.
There's some amazing AI type things happening with writing, but I can't imagine that any publication is going to count on that at any time soon.
No. I'm not going to help an AI take my job.
Probably a good move. That's similar to what we had there. Okay, I think we kind of got most of the questions. Yeah, I had one last question then, is what is a short story favorite of yours that has really stuck with you and made a difference to you? Like something that might be recent, might be classic. What's a short story that really changed the way you thought about something or really stuck with you? I had time to think about it, so I'll just mention mine is it's been years that I read it. Was The Big Front Yard. That was a Clifford Smack story that the aliens had come to Earth, and the fellow that they were talking to was like a junk salesman kind of person or something along that line, and he sold them the concept of paint, that they didn't know what paint was, and he sold them the concept of paint, and they thought that was wonderful. And I just really, that always stuck with me, was that idea of selling a concept like that. It was cool.
And I told Jane this earlier, but Flowers for Algernon, for me, just the way it talks about the fleeting nature of life, and even, we always think we're going to be able to think and be the person that we are now, and life doesn't always even give us that. So just make the most of every moment.
I think we're done.
I think that was it. Saved by the bell.
Thanks, guys. It was wonderful.
Thank you all very much. It was a great panel. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay. Thank
care.
you.